Well, good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be home. I was gone for about a week and a half. It's the longest I think 2 Sundays in a row, and I don't remember, Karen, the last time we were gone 2 Sundays in a row. But I was seeing kids in Corpus Christi, Texas, and then went to Honduras. But we're back now, and so we are continuing this series on Not by Bread Alone, and I'm so thankful for Josh for putting this together. 52 weeks, 66 books, and I tell you, I've been in church a long time, and I can't remember ever going through the whole Bible in a year in a study format like this. So I'm excited, and so we're going to be in the often read and studied and mined book of Leviticus today. I know you probably read it 2 or 3 times already in anticipation. So here we are in Leviticus, where there's a lot of blood, there's a lot of killing, there's a lot of sacrifice, there's mildew, oozy sores, bodily fluids, and Rick Fortenberry's favorite word, discharge. Just go up to Rick Fortenberry and say, "What's your issue with discharge?" You know, and so that's why it makes. So we're going to just admit some things from the beginning when we come into Leviticus. One, it's hard. It's not hard. It's not easy. It's not easy to navigate for several reasons. One, every one of us are Western readers and Western learners. And if you could just picture the world and you draw a line from somewhere in Europe down through Italy, and you have Turkey and everything to the east and then everything to the west, we're the West. That's the West. And we think differently and we learn different. This was written thousands of years ago by Eastern people, Middle Eastern people, and they just wrote different. The other thing is that it was written thousands of years ago. We're thousands of years removed from the time and place that they wrote. So our approach to Leviticus, unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, maybe it just is to try to outline it. And that's fine. There's some good outlines in there. And there's some, and even approach it from a methodical perspective, and that's not necessarily bad either. But what we're going to try to do is go up in the atmosphere about 20,000 feet and get a large view, the big picture of Leviticus, and try to see it as a whole. So we, again, just like Clay and Derek, we're not going to read every verse, of course. I encourage you to do so, but I'm going to try to give you a framework with which to read today. And by the way, speaking of Genesis and Exodus, Clay did an awesome job, did he not? And I mean, he's just a great teacher. And of course, I was in Corpus that week, and then the next week last week I was on the way back from Honduras. So I got to hear Derek, and from Derek, he outlined it so well with getting the people out of Egypt and then the Egypt out of people. And that's what we're going to continue with today. Clay did a great job of how God made it wonderful and beautiful, and how we just messed it up, and how he's beginning the redemption process of that. Did a great job. And then also, I love the fact of what Clay point he made whenever Dinah was violated and her brothers took care of the situation. If you're a brother, you're going to protect your sister. He said, the only thing worse than being murdered is being circumcised and then murdered. And I thought, well, that is pretty much justice right there. And so that stuck with me for sure. But so a couple of resources I want to give you that's kind of helped shape my thinking on some of this. And there we go. Some resources. How many are familiar with the Bama podcast? Bama. I'm not even sure what that means. But season 1, episode 25, A Kingdom of What? is about Leviticus. They do a good job of dealing with Leviticus, and especially the priesthood and stuff in there. Leviticus Alive by a guy named Caruso. Now that's a pen name. I don't know what his real name is, but he sent a book, or he sent a letter promoting this book. It's a preacher from the Midwest, and he sent this letter out about 15 years ago, and I just happened to get it. And he wrote a book of essays on Leviticus. And I thought, well, I'll support the guy. So I bought 3 copies. I said, I'll buy one for me. And then I thought, okay, who else would want a book on Leviticus? And I bought one for Scott Caldwell and Mike Williams, because that's the only other 2 people I could think of. You remember me buying you that book, Scott? You didn't read it either. Yeah. Mike Williams probably read it. And so I gave it to, I think I gave it to you. If not, I owe you a book. But I started reading that. I was like, this is actually some good stuff. So he's got some good stuff in there, especially a stuff on atonement. And if you're familiar with the Bible Project videos, they do a beautiful job of just taking things that are difficult and making them make sense. And because most of us are very visual learners, and they do a good job with that. But theirs on Leviticus and atonement are very, very good. Then there's an old book that has been revamped in recent years called None of These Diseases. That's the authors, Macmillan and Stern. And I think it's Stern, maybe it's Stein, maybe that's autocorrect. But just look up None of These Diseases. And they do a good job of taking things, they're both doctors, and they look at things from Leviticus from a medical, Exodus and Leviticus from a medical perspective. And it gives you some good things. The very thing about someone who has an infectious disease, and the priest recognizes this, they had to be quarantined, or they need to stay outside the camp, or they need to wash, or whatever. Those were practices that weren't necessarily done then, and some of the purification rituals were not just ceremonial, they were medical. And so they do a lot of stuff with that to help understand. Those are all different resources. So as we look at Leviticus, we want to look at some key verses, key chapters, and some key phrases that are in there. And the first 2 are going to be from the book of Exodus. Actually, before I get there, let me give you some context. The context of Leviticus, everything has a context. Everything's written in a frame. The context of Leviticus was, one, it was written at the foot of Mount Sinai. Okay? The same time and same location as Exodus. So as they come to Mount Sinai, Moses gets the 10 Commandments, and all that happens, and everything that Derek was talking about last week, this happens at the same time, at the same place. So it's just a continuation, if you will. Leviticus would be kind of a continuation of Exodus. And probably, and I don't know when this happened, there was... and maybe different ones, Scott, you may know when Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy became Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, because in the New Testament you see them just as the law or different things, the Pentateuch, and they were kind of referred to as one thing. I don't know when they were divided, but at any rate, this is the form that we have it in. The book of Exodus sets up Leviticus. There's a mix of history and preparation. Let me lower that. I feel like I'm being a little, when I go down to look at my notes, a little loud. The narrative of Exodus 1 through 19, and then the preparation in 19 through 40 of Exodus sets up everything in Leviticus. Moses meets with God during Leviticus. The glory of the Lord comes on the tent of meeting and fills the tabernacle. And Leviticus begins to have some different instructions there. Moses instructs the Levites, who will then in turn teach the people. And that's kind of what we get to on some of our key verses. The first one here is in Exodus 19. And you think, why all the way back to Exodus? Because really, if you look at them, you see them together. Now listen to this verse, Exodus 19, 5 through 6. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my commandments. Now, this is happening at Mount Sinai. They've just been delivered from Egypt, and Moses is on the mountain, is getting the 10 Commandments. All these things are happening. Now, if you people obey me fully and keep my commandments, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be, here you go, for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now, one of the key verses of understanding Leviticus is understanding this verse that though the whole earth is mine, out of all the nations, you will be my holy nation, and you will be a kingdom of what? A kingdom of priests. Not just a kingdom that has priests, but a kingdom of what? Kingdom of priests. Hang on to that thought when we get to priesthood later on, okay? The next verse, key verse, happens at the end. That's not in Leviticus, but in Exodus, because it was a continuation, is at the end of Exodus. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So this is the first time I'm teaching from an iPad. And obviously it's connected to the text. And I just got a text from my brother-in-law that said Happy Father's Day, and it distracted me. So I don't know how to turn that off. So sorry for the pause. But now in 2 minutes, I'm going to get another one. I don't know how to do that. I might probably need someone who's 21 to show me how to do this. But Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and a fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the Israelites during their travels. Now this is key, because this is the last verses of Exodus before he starts the next set of instructions in Leviticus. And what they're doing, this tabernacle and fire and smoke represented God's presence being continually with them. And what they were doing, as he called them to be a holy nation, different from anybody else, a nation of priests, a nation that learned to live in the presence, with the presence of God among them. And so all those are some key things that are happening before you even turn into Leviticus. So God is working some great things in the nation there. The next key verse is found in Leviticus 10. Again, these are key verses to understanding what's happening. Leviticus 10, last part of verse 9. You and your sons are not to drink wine or other fermented drink whenever you go into the tent of meeting, or you will die. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, so that, you ready? So that you can distinguish between the holy and the common, between the clean and the unclean. The key here is that they were learning to distinguish, to think about, to give some thought to what was holy, what was clean, as opposed to what was common and unclean. Instead of just saying, oh, we'll go do this. No, stop and think. Let's distinguish. That word there is very important. Distinguish what is holy. So another key, and we're going to get to all that in just a minute, because we're going to hit some key words, but these are important. Leviticus 16, we'll hit that in just a minute, but the Day of Atonement is central to everything happening. In fact, I'm fixing to show you a picture that the Day of Atonement is the middle of everything that's happening in Exodus. Then there's these key phrases. 49 times in the NIV, I am the Lord, which basically means I'm saying this, go do it. I'm the Lord. This is the final word on it. I am the Lord. 5 times in the NIV, behold, the phrase, be holy because I am holy. 10 times in the NIV, he says, be holy. So Leviticus, there's these key things about holiness, about following the Lord, and doing, I am the Lord. I am the Lord your God. You do this because you have to do this, and I'm telling you to do this and be obedient. Sometimes God explains himself, sometimes he doesn't. And ours is not to know. If we really understood everything, if we had a reason for everything God does what he does, I think our brains would just catch a cramp and we'd be catatonic. You know, we couldn't handle it. So there's a unique structure here to the book of Leviticus that I think will help us understand, and it's called a chiasm or a chiasmus or a chiastic structure, and basically it's a literary technique that we're probably not, until I started studying Leviticus and looked at this, I'd never really heard of this much, but it is a very common thing in these type of biblical writings, especially way back then, and even some now. How many have heard of haiku? Remember haiku when you were in elementary school and had to write those haiku poems and how it all worked and all this? Well, haiku is a way of writing poetry. Yeah, I can't remember what it was, but I remember it was kind of fun doing it. It's the only thing I liked about poetry was haiku. That's all I think I remember about poetry is haiku. Well, think about chiastic structure is that. It's a way of writing so that things flow a certain way. And it's a technique where ideas are developed in a structure so as to emphasize a main point. So, and it looks like this, okay? There's this main point, and everything leading up to the main point emphasizes the main point. And then when you come back from the main point, they are related to the first points leading up to the main point. Now that's very clear, I know. So this is, let me go a step further here. So you have the main point, and you have the top part and the bottom part that might be at two different parts in the writing, but they all point to the main point. And then you have the second subpoint or the second supporting thing here, that the top part relates to the bottom part, and they're at two different parts of the writing. But all of it relates to the main point. Same thing here. So what you have going is you may be reading along, and I wish I could be on two sides, but you may be reading along in a text, and it leads to this, and then you hit the main point, and then you come back, and this sounds a lot like this, but it's in a different part of the text. This sounds a lot like this, but it's in a different part of the writing. This sounds like the beginning, but it's at the end. But all of it has this in the middle. So what does that have to do with Leviticus? Well, here you go. The Day of Atonement is chapter 16. It's right smack dab, not necessarily numerically in the book, but it is the center of the book. Leading to that, you have these words, these key words. Atonement is dealt with in chapter 1 through 7. And 23 through 27, which is the last several chapters of the book. The next part is priesthood, chapters 8 through 10 and 21 through 22. They're at different parts of the book, but but they're related. And then the last part is holy versus common, and those things all are real close to one another, and it comes to where right around that Day of Atonement. So the most important chapter, everything leading up to, is this big Day of Atonement. And then everything else supports it and what is going towards that. Now, the way it breaks down further, the first 16 chapters, or first 15 chapters really, actually that's a typo there, he describes describes the big picture. He gives a lot of details about this is who you are. After the Day of Atonement, the holy versus common, priesthood and atonement have to do with go be. Now go live this out this way. So this first part of Leviticus, all the way to the Day of Atonement, is a lot of practical things, or rather a lot of big picture things, a lot of ideals. And then the last part is how you live this out. Now, let me pause, because I can pause. I'm right on time, so I can pause here. By the way, there's a test at the end. Okay, there's a test at the end, and here's the only question on the test. As you listen, especially as we're about to dive into this, where do you see Jesus? Because really, that's what all this is about. Where do you see Jesus? And so be thinking about that as you go along. All right, questions on this. I know that's a lot of just fire hydrant, getting a drink out of type deal. Does that somewhat make sense a little bit? And so this is, instead of a main point A, Roman numeral 1, A, B, 1, 2, 3, the whole outline they taught us in school. This is a different type of outline, basically, for reading the book of Leviticus. And you'll see this in a lot of places. And actually, there are some people love chiasms so much that they make chiasms that don't even look like chiasms, But you'll also see this in the Bible, too, where you have what's called theological sandwiches sometimes, where they'll be making a big point, and the meat of it is, and you see this in Jesus' teachings and his miracles a lot, or the authors will use miracles and teachings to support this big thing that's happening. But that one was for free. Yes.
I Googled it, and
well, there you go. I hope I'm right with Google.
the things actually, the center was always the same, but the one on the first and the last one are reversed. And I noticed if you put those in scriptural order, then the holy and atonement on the bottom would be switched, put it in the order in the book, and then it would be what it said when I Googled it.
Mm-hmm. So there are, I don't have a board, but so there are, and what you're referring to, I think, Johnny, is there this is not a static thing. When you talk about chiastic structures, sometimes they do that, and what I believe you're talking about is, this one does it? Okay. Oh, I'm right with Google, good. I'm somebody, the new phone books are here. If y'all got that and you're old. Do what, Johnny? One more time.
You got to put them in the order that they're in the book. So the bottom one would be holy, priesthood, and atonement. You put it in the order of the scripture.
Right. Oh, so if you switch it down. And so they're like that. Sometimes they cross. So you have this thing in the middle, and depending on the chiasm, they may cross. And it depends on the author and how they want to lay it out. So there are different structures with this. The idea, though, things are not necessarily in the nice little term paper outline that they taught us to do in our Western American culture here, that sometimes the writing is a little bit different. Okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to take these words, atonement, priesthood, holy versus common, and Day of Atonement. And we're going to kind of break them down a little bit and just kind of give you an overview of what's happening in all of this. So as you go back and read, I did it several times. I read through Leviticus several times in preparation over the last few months. And then also I read it like this. So I would read 1 through 7 and then whatever the 23 through 27, and I would read it like that. And so each way it works, but I do encourage you to read it. Make it through all the oozy sores and mildew. So you get this word atonement that he talks about. Atonement literally means to cover over. In this case, to cover over death with a substitutionary offering. And so what does atonement teach the people when you atone for things? And there's some strange things. So like you get along here and you realize, hey, I've got some mold or mildew in my house. Well, the law says the priest has to come in and inspect it, and if it's this mold or this mold, you got to go offer a sacrifice for your house to atone for the mildew. Well, why? Well, atonement for that did the house sin? And those are our logical questions. But why is mold and mildew there? Why is it growing? Why is it this infectious disease here? Because sin is in the world. And whenever there is atonement, whenever you see the presence of sin, there's atonement. Sin, what does atonement teach the people? Sin is costly. There's the obvious atonement when wrongdoing is done. That's what we call direct sin or a direct offense. Atonement was also made when we see the universal effects of sin. Contact with a dead body, contact with blood, wrongdoing of another person, whether it be we're not at peace with one another, or I do something wrong or you do something wrong to me. We have to have a fellowship offering of some level. Why is that even there? Because sin's in the world. Why? I come in contact with a dead body. Could there be some health things? Possibly so. Blood. Could there be some health things? Sure. Why does a wife and a husband have to have purification, make atonement after they have a child? Well, because of everything that goes along with that. Why pain in childbirth? Because sin's in the world. Why is there blood? Why is there all this happening? Because there's pain, because there's sin in the world. And so all of that trust had to do is with reminders of sin. Same thing with mildew and mold. Why is it there? Because sin's in the world. And atonement reminds us that because sin's in the world, death's in the world, and life is being lost through blood in some way, God is bigger than all of this right here, and he is atoning for it. He's doing something to cover this for us. So it's big everyday life lessons that they're learning, became part of what they did. Thus, the atonement rituals became a reminder of sin. Hebrews 10:3 says that they became these blood of bulls and goats were unable to take away sin, but they were the annual reminder that sin is in the world and sin affects us. So, also during this time, it was also the last part of in 23 through 30. You have these different feasts, and I don't think I put them up there. No, I didn't. There's these feasts of the Lord that's talked about in the last part of the atonement chapters. And if you have been around a while and remember when Pam Spencer was here and she did the study of the feast, and I think we've probably done some of that since. Good stuff. I encourage you to go look these up. Each one of these commemorated and reminded of the Lord's deliverance and his provision. And so there were 7 feasts. One, there was the Passover, to remind them of how they were saved from that 10th plague when death came in Egypt and they had just gotten out of there and it passed them over. The very fact that they could leave Egypt was because death passed them over. There was this feast of unleavened bread, which they ate to remind them that the haste in which they left Egypt, in the haste of their deliverance, they didn't even have time for bread to rise, for the yeast to activate and to work. So they remembered that. There was this first fruits, which ironically we're getting to next week in Joshua 5, and where they came into the promised land and they ate the fruits from the land, God delivering the promise, and that was the day the manna stopped. And it was his deliverance and his provision. There was the Feast of Weeks, or what is in the New Testament called Pentecost, where they celebrate the harvest, where they come and they're like, here you go, Lord, this is yours. Thank you for providing this harvest for us. The Feast of Trumpets, which is a really interesting one because there's a lot of different things in the Jewish days. This Feast of Trumpets is kind of getting ready for Day of Atonement, and that is the case as well. In which they're remembering their called remembrance preparation for the next 2 feasts. But also there's some significance there of blowing a shofar and calling people to the law for it to be read. There's the Day of Atonement, which we're going to get to in a minute, which is like the biggest day in all of Jewish history and it's Yom Kippur today. It's the Day of Atonement. We're going to go into that a little bit more. And then there's the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, where they remembered when they wandered around because of their disobedience. Then you have these holy days, and all this is at the end of Leviticus. And there's the weekly Sabbath. So we took a Sabbath yesterday. Started Friday night and went to CR and then came home and didn't really do much yesterday morning on purpose. We had a lot going on just coming back from out of town and just had a lot going on Friday during the day. And so we just kind of rested. And it was going to end at noon. Then we could go do something. Well, about 10 o'clock, I'm shaking my leg. I'm just really shaking my leg. And we pushed through, made it to noon, and then I went and we did things after that. And I told Karen, we're sitting on the back porch drinking coffee and just visiting, and I said, the Jews were an agrarian based. They lived off the land. They were nomadic. And whenever you got to move everything ever so often, you've got to pack it all up. And you work daylight to dark and even longer. How do you take, I don't do that. I don't, most of us don't do that. But how did they take a day off? I mean, I can imagine they're like, come on, Hadassah, we got to get to work. No, honey, no, Mordecai, it's Sabbath. How brilliant was that for the Lord to put that in for mankind to do? How brilliant was that? And that was the weekly Sabbaths. They had the Sabbath year, which was every 7 years. They didn't plant. Let it rest. Let the land have a Sabbath. Can you imagine not if your food and livelihood are on that land and you don't plant? What do? Are you nervous all year? Yeah, you are. And Eddie, really, you just got pointed out by Benita. What if you don't grow tomatoes this year? So, huh? He's gonna be shaking his leg for sure, like, good night. And then you have the 7 Sabbath years, and this is the fun one, the year of Jubilee. Every 50th year, everything reverts back. All the land you had to sell to make it happen, guess what? You get it back. Everything reverts. It's like Control-Alt-Delete, reboot. Don't you hate it when IT people say, I just can't get this to work? Well, you got to reboot. Oh, it worked. Thanks. It's a reboot. Every 50th year, everything goes back the way it was. Why? What were they learning? They were learning to trust God. That even whenever I don't plant, I'm going to take care of you. Every week, whenever my legs start shaking about 10:30 on Saturday morning, you're going to be all right. You're going to get it done. It's going to be fine. And whenever you think you've got all this, you know what? It's really all mine anyway. You go back to what I gave you. So these feast days and these Sabbaths were all built into them, okay? And there's a reason that was there, so that they could be a holy nation and a priesthood, a nation of priests, okay? So that's the first one. The second word we're going to look at in this as we flow through Leviticus is priesthood. And this is the picture. Remember, I just said it. You're going to be, among all the nations, you're going to be a holy nation, and a nation of what? And priest. So the priest did several things. They looked different because their job was different. All their robes, the way they handled what their job was, how they were supposed to do things, and everything they did was very different because their job was very different. They kept flames burning. They kept sacrifices. They kept up. They taught the people. And so they were teachers and leaders in Israel. And they taught the law, they explained things, they discerned things. Can you imagine, as just your everyday common Jewish person living in the tribe of Benjamin, and you have to figure out what Leviticus is meaning? Who do you go to? You go to the priest. What do I need to do? I wronged my cousin. Okay, this is the prescribed offering. Y'all need to get together, you need to talk, you both need to do this. Okay, thank you. They taught the people. And whenever I first read read Leviticus several years ago, read it, but just read it again, I was like, it's about discipleship. They're teaching the people. Because look, let me go back. Okay, here we go. You and your sons are not to drink. This is the last thing. So that you can distinguish between the holy and the common, between the clean and the unclean. The whole thing that the priests were to do, the priesthood, were to teach the people. So you have, on this first side, you have God, you have the Levites in the priesthood, and you have Israel. They are the ones that are representing God to the people, and they're representing the people to God. But they're not just a nation that has priests, they're a nation of what? They're a nation of priests. So if Israel is this holy nation among all nations, a nation that belongs to God, that follows and does things different than other nations, they become a nation of priests in which they represent the world or the rest of the nations to God, and God to the rest of the world. in which they come in a stranger. And look, if you look at the land that they lived in, at that time, there was no place to travel in the world pretty much except through that land. And when they come in the land and they see things different, it's Saturday. What are y'all laying around for? It's Sabbath. Why didn't y'all plant this year? It's a Sabbath year. I thought you owned this the last time I was through here. Yeah, but we went through a sabbatical. We went through a year of Jubilee. Now I don't own this. But I own this. I got this back. I don't understand. Well, let me tell you about my God. So they are representing God to the people, and the people before God. That's why if I acquired slaves, or I acquired something from another country or people group or whatever, and the nation of Israel conquered them, when that happened, guess what happened on the Sabbath? They didn't work either. And if you sell me something, you sell me a mule or a team of oxen, guess what? They don't work on the Sabbath either. And it becomes everything pointing to God. And when people see that, they're like, oh, wow. Mike preached on Rahab a couple of weeks ago. Here was a person in Jericho, a Gentile, who came in, and she saw and heard about the Lord and became part of their nation. She became part of that holy nation that represented God. So that's the whole idea of priesthood. Does that make sense? So there were a nation that had priests, but they became a nation of priests. And that's going to play out a little bit more here when we get to this verse here in a minute. Holy verse is common here as we head up to the Day of Atonement. Some of the key verses here, let me get chapter 11. Verse 43. I don't think I have that. Oh, I do. How about that? Do not defile yourselves by any of these creatures. Do not make yourselves unclean by means of them, or be made unclean by them. Talking about the food laws. Because, that's what we always wonder about, isn't it? Or that's one of the many things in Leviticus we wonder about. What about the food laws? Why can we have a good pulled pork sandwich now and they couldn't then? Does that mean we can eat a gecko now? No, but it means you can eat crawfish, and catfish. So, hallelujah, right? You can eat all the geckos and monitor lizards you want. I'll just have a little crustacean and a lobster. Crawfish, Louisiana lobsters, Maine got them big ones, but I'll take both. Do not make yourself unclean by means of them, or be made unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. There's that phrase. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves on the ground. I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore be holy, because I am holy. And then these are the regulations concerning animals, birds, and every living creature that moves in the water, and every creature that moves on the ground. You must distinguish between the clean and the unclean, between living creatures that may be eaten, those that may not be eaten. And so, all right, flip over. I said the next one. Yeah, 20. Now I'm in a hurry. 20, because I got to get to the test. 20, 24. But I said, you will possess their land. No, that's not it. Oh, here we are, verse 25. You must therefore make a distinction between clean and unclean, do not defile yourselves. And then I have set apart as clean as unclean. You are to be holy, because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. Now, there's a lot here. You hear words like distinguish. I have set you apart. Make a distinction. Do not defile yourself. Uses the same word each time in the original Hebrew there. And the principle is to set yourself apart. This set apart, or only take from things that are set apart. You distinguish what I'm telling you. Why? Could there be health reasons? Yes, and possibly. there could be some things there. Spiritually, somehow these things set them apart from other nations that they were coming in and going to be around and driving out, and how the world would see them. Did this somehow defile them? Yes, and probably so. Do it because I am the Lord and I said so? Yes, and definitely. There's no possibly on that one. That is a definite yes, because I told you to. Does God always explain himself? No, he doesn't. But we've got to be careful and caution on some of these things, that the resources even, not to give logical explanations that sounds good, and they may be right, when basically simple obedience just does the trick. Why? I really can't explain that, but just don't. Why can't I stick that fork in that outlet, Dad? Ask my 4-year-old son. Well, son, you just don't do it. It's going to hurt. I can't explain to you all the things about I couldn't do that now, but much less then, about how that works. I just know you don't. Just don't do it. Okay. So that's and remember, again, in chapter 10, where he says, teach the people. And Ezekiel 44, which was written much, much later, and where they're having to redo all this because it all fell apart and it's coming back again. It's kind of a good commentary verse. He says, they, the priest, are to teach my people the difference between the holy and the common, and show them how to distinguish between the unclean and the clean. And that's basically what this whole thing, when it comes to holy and common and priesthood, are about. Well, we come to the big day, and that is the Day of Atonement. One of the most sacred, if not the most sacred day in all of Israel. It was the day in which sins were atoned for by a substitutionary offering of blood. It represented for the people that God was covering their sins, and a removal, okay, this is key, a removal of the pollution sin created so that God's presence could continue. Now let me give you this picture here. End of Exodus, they build this tabernacle. There's not been a sacrifice yet. The glory of the Lord comes down, fills it, and he instructs these people. And then they start sacrificing to cover for sin. And there's blood, and there's repentance, and there's just death that's happening all inside this tabernacle. And it pollutes it. And this once a year, they come into this holy of holy place with this substitutionary offering. And then there's this other ritual where there's these 2 goats and they cast lots for it. One is sacrificed and one is sent off into the wilderness, carried off, and there's a whole thing there. And then the priest has to offer something for his own sin. And it's at that point where the whole nation is waiting in anticipation. Is the Lord's presence going to continue with us because of sin? And it is that day that they practice Sabbath, that they wait and contemplate what's happening. And that's that chapter 16. It's the big day in which sins are covered, atoned for another year. Now, where do you see Jesus in all of this? In the blood, okay? Eugene?
Forgiveness of sins.
The forgiveness. Now, the interesting thing about forgiveness, how long did that Day of Atonement last? 1 year. Until what? Until the next year. Why? It was what? It was temporary. Hebrews tells us what? That it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. Okay? So go with me now. What takes away sin?
Jesus doesn't take all of that is null and void when he is the sacrifice.
Jesus takes it all. It's all null and void. So what does all this mean in Leviticus?
Seed of the people we're supposed to reflect it.
Okay, hang on to that one, Tyler. I want you to, when I point to you, remember, Might want to write it down because I'd forget. But I want you to say that again. So, but between that, there's a couple other things. Between Leviticus sacrifices, Jesus' sacrifice, and what Tyler just said, what is all this Leviticus stuff doing? Preparing us for what? For Jesus. So whenever they come along and they're like, another sacrifice, I got another sacrifice. You remember the old Dunkin' Donuts commercial? Got to make the donuts. I got to sacrifice the bull. You know, over and over and over again. And then all of a sudden somebody says, behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. Whoa, there's Jesus. That's what all this means. That's what all this means. And so when we appeal to that sacrifice that prepared us for this, see, Jesus is all over this. We prepare and we appeal to that sacrifice. All that, as Tara said, becomes null and void. And our hearts, it's the Leviticus is preparing the hearts of the people for the Messiah, for his grace to be received. So that, say it, Tyler? We reflect him. So I was talking to somebody. I was like, yeah, I'm teaching Leviticus here for too long. They're like, Leviticus? Why would anybody need to know that? I said, because it's still happening today. Now, we're not sacrificing bulls and goats. There's actually Brandon Creekbronk told me there's actually a ordinance in the city of Monroe that says you can't. Because people were, but, that's a whole nother story. And we're not doing that. Why? Because the ultimate sacrifice has been paid for us, and we appeal to that. And that changes us so that when people come in contact with us, they can see there's something different about you. Who are you? I had a great idea when we left CR Friday night. I said, I got a great idea. Karen said, what? I said, let's go get some ice cream. And we don't get ice cream. She said, that's an outstanding idea. So we stopped at Mac's and got some Bluebell ice cream. We went home and mashed up some of her blackberries, and it was really good. Watched the rest of a college base. What a great Sabbath, So I think it becomes our thing. And the guy said, I had a hat on, had the gospel symbols, and he said, hey, I like your hat. What's that mean? And I just went right there. And I said, that's the hope I have. I hope you have that. He said, yeah, I go to church, so I believe that. I'm like, okay, good deal. Well, be blessed, my friend. And so, God is still doing what God was doing for Israel, getting them out of Egypt and getting Egypt out of them. That's what Leviticus is about. God is still doing to us. He's gotten us out of our bondage. And now he's getting the bondage out of us. And it may not be through a Levitical things, but he's still teaching us to be the people of God. And that's what the community is about. The challenge is still the same. Father, we love you. And even though we wade through some of the challenges that are here and still scratch our heads with everything that's there, we thank you for it. And I pray, Father, that the principle and the spirit of Leviticus lives in our life as you put people to teach us how to live for you. And in turn, as my brother just said, we reflect you in everything we do. May we be holy as you are holy because you are the Lord. Amen. Love you guys. There's Leviticus in 50 minutes.